All right, so good evening again. We will be looking at this book tonight. First Buddhist Women, which is a set of poems out of the 2,500 years ago, the Awakening Women. So the chapter we're looking at this week is Wines. This is a beautiful book by Susan Murcott, and she has looked at the commentaries from the commentarial tradition, has pulled out the real stories behind these monks. So there are some poems and stories here about wives that I want to go through. So I've talked about some of this before. I'm just going to jump straight into the first poem. This poem is from a nun, Isadasi, who was married and not very happy in her marriage and couldn't do very much about it. So I'm just going to read this poem, and then I'll talk about this and what that brings up about the state of the position of women in this culture at that time. In the splendid city of Ujjaini, my father was a good merchant. I was his only daughter, charming and beloved. Then a rich merchant from Saket sent a man of a noble family to ask for me. My father gave me to that merchant as a daughter-in-law. Morning and evening, I bowed to the feet of my father-in-law and mother-in-law. If I saw my beloved, his sisters, his brothers, or even his retinue, I trembled and gave up my seat. I tried to please them with every kind of food and drink, and gave to all the proper portions. I rose early and went to my lord's room, having already washed my hands and feet, and on the threshold I came to him with cupped hands, bringing comb, mirror, soap, and ornaments, as though I were a servant. I dressed him and groomed him myself. I boiled the rice, I washed the pots, and looked after him, as a mother would her only son. And though I was devoted to him, a humble and affectionate servant, who was virtuous and got up early, my husband felt nothing for me. He told his mother and father, I am leaving. I can't live in the same house with Isadasi. End poem. Horrible, eh? So the history sounds like, 3,000 years ago, when the Aryans first moved into India, women had a reasonably robust status in the culture, and there were real partnerships in marriage. But somehow, as the Brahmanic tradition grew, and as the Aryan people became more stable in India, the position of women slipped. So by around about the time of the Buddha, women were pretty much chattel. They were pretty much all Sudra, the lowest of the four castes. So they were just really not really regarded as people. They were property. The proper state of a woman was to be married and to have children. And as out of that culture in India, the four stages of life emerged. So you were, what were you? You were a student, then a householder, and then a renunciant, and then you left home and you went wandering off I've forgotten the word, but it's, you basically wandered off into the mountains and the woods. But that was for men. So when men did this, the women stayed at home. And they had nothing. The eldest son would take them in and look after them. So this is a pretty horrible life. Here's another story. This is out of the Udana, which is another collection of early stories of Buddhism. I won't read the whole of it, but there was... no, I will read the whole of it. I have heard that on one occasion, the Blessed One was staying near Savatthi at Jeta's Grove, Anapadika's monastery, and on that occasion, Venerable Sangamaji had arrived at Savatthi to see the Blessed One. His former wife heard, Master Sangamati, they say, has arrived at Savatthi. Taking her small charge, she went to Jeta's Grove. On that occasion, Venerable Sangamaji, was sitting at the root of a tree for the day's abiding. His former wife went to him and on arrival said to him, Look after me, contemplative. a woman with a little son. And when this was said, Venerable Maji remained silent a second time and a third time. He just remained silent. Goes on a little while. The Blessed One, with his divine eye, purified and surpassing the human, saw Venerable Sangamaji's former wife misbehaving in that way. Then, on realizing the significance of that, the Blessed One on that occasion proclaimed, at her coming he didn't delight, at her leaving he didn't grieve, a victor in battle, freed from the tie. He's what I call a Brahman. So this obviously parallels the Buddha's own story, where he left his wife and his small child and went wandering off to find his own awakening. Now, in that case, his wife and his small child were under the custody of the royal family, and so there's presumably some safety net. But even in that tradition, as we just talked about, the status of a woman is not a robust one when she's on her own. So this is pretty devastating stuff. So it does sound like in the Buddhist tradition, Buddha he allowed the order of the nuns to emerge, and in Buddhist tradition, it does sound like there was a somewhat gentle relationship. There was more equality in marriage partnerships. Women had more rights, but it's still pretty tough. So I'm going to read, I think, 3 more of these stories, and then we will talk. The first one is Pada Kapilani. Pada Kapilani, according to the legend, she and Kashyapa, Mahakashyapa, who was one of the Buddha's main disciples, they had been partners many times in previous lives. So in this particular life, in the time of the Buddha, they were both born, and both of them told their parents that they wanted to be renunciants. Now, the girl didn't have a choice. The boy presumably had more of a choice, but it still wasn't popular with the family. So both their parents went looking around to try and find a compatible partner. And they found these two, and so they brought them together. Neither of them wanted to get married, but they did get married. And they privately agreed not to consummate the marriage. And then after they were married, they left together to go find the Buddha. And the story is that he walked in front and she walked behind. And they were both equal in renunciation, but just out of habit or culture, they were actually following the tradition of married couples where the man walks in front and the woman walks behind. But they walked off to find the Buddha. Of course, Kashyapa immediately became ordained and joined the community of monks. Bhadda did not, because there wasn't a community of nuns. So she hung around outside for 5 years as a mendicant until Mahapajapati, Buddha's stepmom, became enabled by the Buddha to head the order of nuns. And so she then slipped into that stream and became a disciple of Pajapati. So it's kind of a lovely story, but it still brings out the same basic point. Here's her poem. Kashyapa, the Buddha's son and heir, deep meditator, knows that he has lived before, sees heaven and hell, and won't be born again. He is a sage who has attained the highest knowledge. In just this same way, Pada Kapilani, with the same 3 knowledges, has left death behind and bears her last body. We saw misery in the world, the 2 of us, and turned away from home. Now we have finished with mind's obsession and are both grown gentle, quenched, and cool. So they both finished the journey. It's a beautiful poem. The 3 knowledges, by the way, are past lives, a knowledge of the karma of all being, which is there for all future rebirths, and then knowledge of the truth of suffering, dukkha, so the ability to end suffering. I'll read that poem one more time. Actually, no, I'll go straight to this. This is a modern version of these. It's originally advertised. It's by Matty Weingeist, called The First Free Women. It's originally advertised as a translation of these poems. But it turns out it's a very free translation. It's kind of a rewriting of them. So, page 46. But some of them are really lovely. After our wedding, my husband and I put on our robes together and soon went our separate ways. Not exactly what most would call a honeymoon. Is that what love looks like? Maybe, when you see what love is and what it isn't. Marriage is hard. The good times come and go. True love doesn't throw a curtain over the whole world and imprison whoever it cares about the most on an empty stage. When the mind is free, it's free of expecting more than is reasonable from any one person. So he kind of goes to what he thinks the essence is and then rewrites the poem around the essence, I think. Okay, so we'll go now to Mutta. Mutta was the daughter of a poor Brahmin family, and because of that station, again, have to be married. You're a Brahmin, so you're going to be married to somebody out of the same caste. But because they were a poor family, she was not worthy of a good husband, so she was married to a hunchback Brahmin, which was a bad thing at the time. And she was very unhappy in the marriage and eventually convinced her husband to let her go free, to let her go ordain as a nun, and he let her. So here's her poem. Free, I am free. I am free by means of the three crooked things, mortar, pestle, and my crooked husband. I am free from birth and death, and all that drag me back. So the first verse, free by means of the three, that's pointing at the fact that she's free from those three, but she's also free by means of them because her husband let her free, which was required. His absolute permission was required. And then the last verse, free from birth and death, truly liberated, which is what Weingeist was talking about here, that when the mind is free, true love doesn't throw a curtain over the whole world and imprison whoever it cares about. When the mind is free, it's free from expecting. So I'll read this poem again. Free, I am free. I am free by means of the three crooked things, mortar, pestle, and my crooked husband. I am free from birth and death and all that drag me back. So this is my favorite of the ones I'm going to read tonight. And there's another one after this, but this is my favorite of the ones I'm going to read. Well, this is an anonymous person, and she was set free. So here's her poem. Free, I am free. How glad I am to be free from my pestle. My cooking pot seems worthless to me, and I can't even bear to look at his sun umbrella. My husband disgusts me, so I destroy greed and hate with a sizzle, and I am the same woman who goes to the foot of the tree and says to herself, "Ah, happiness," and meditates with happiness. I was wrong. She wasn't set free. She's still married, and she hates her marriage, but she's practicing on her own, right, within the marriage. So free, I am free. How glad I am to be free from my pestle. My cooking pot seems worthless to me, and I can't even bear to look at his sun umbrella. My husband disgusts me, so I destroy greed and hate with a sizzle. And I am the same woman who goes to the foot of the tree and says to herself, "Ah, happiness," and meditates with happiness. So this is the version that we have in this book. Free, finally free from having to stroke my husband's little umbrella until it stands up straight. His releases came quickly with lots of grunting. Mine has taken a little longer and came with the sound of a straight bamboo being cleanly sliced into 2 even pieces. I now know for myself where true release comes from and where it leads. A seat at the foot of any tree. So here's another one. This is the one. So this is 2 people who are married, Kappa and Kala. Kala is the male and Kappa is a female. And they both in sequence ended up going and following Buddha. So Kala went first and he went to talk to the Buddha. Actually, that's right. Kala, so I'm sorry, here's the story. Kala was one of the original 5 renunciants who the Buddha was practicing with when he was really emaciated. And he went off and sat under the Bodhi tree and woke up. And he came back and he said, "What are you? Are you a god?" "No." "What are you?" "I'm awake." So then he taught the Dhammacakkappavattana, the turning the wheel of the Dharma. So Kala was one of those people. And he kind of fell off the wagon. Fell in love, got married to this woman, Kappa. And then at some point along the way, he realized he just wasn't that he didn't like Kappa, but that's not where his heart was. His heart was, he wanted to be a renunciate. He really realized he'd taken a wrong turn. So that's what this story is about. So he goes back to sit, and he goes back and he realizes the truth of Siddhartha's teaching. So he goes back and he says, so this is what Siddhartha said to him. All conquering, all knowing am I, in all dharmas untainted, giving up all, free from wanting, having become enlightened by myself, who may I point out? I have no teacher, there is no one like me, I have no peer in the world or among the gods. I am an arhat in the world, I am an unsurpassed teacher. I alone am the fully enlightened one, I have become cool, quenched. So that's what Kala was coming back to. So here's the poem, which is a conversation. It's written as a conversation between Kala and Kappa. Here's Kala. Once I was an ascetic with a stick in hand. Now I am a deer hunter. It's because of my own lust that I'm in this swamp, and I can't see my way clear to the other shore. Kappa thinks I love her. She's kept her son happy, but I want to cut my ties with her and renounce the world again. So Kappa says to him, great man, don't be angry with me. Wise man, don't be angry with me. How can you be pure or austere when you are controlled by your anger? Kala says, I'm really going to leave. Who'd want to live in Nala, which is this city? Here women use their bodies to trap ascetics who only want to live the Dharma. Kappa. Kala, come back, enjoy my love, I'll be your slave and all my relatives too. Kala, if even a part of what you say were true, Kappa, that would be terrific for someone who was turned on by you. Some horrible stuff, isn't it? So, Kappa, oh Kala, I'm like a takara tree, blossoming on a mountaintop, like a bitter apple vine in flower, like a trumpet flower in the interior of an island. My body has been rubbed with golden sandalwood paste, which is what women were supposed to smell like at the time. I've put on muslin from Varanasi. I am beautiful. Why do you leave me? You are like a bird hunter with that lovely body of yours, but you won't stare me. But Kala, this child fruit of mine is yours. How can you leave me when I have your child? Kala, the wise leave their sons, their relatives, and their wealth. The great set out like an elephant that has broken its tether. Then I'll knock him into the dirt, right here, this son of yours, with a stick, with a knife, and out of grief you won't go. Even if you give our son to the jackals and dogs, I won't turn back, poor woman. And then Susan Murcott says, this rings tenderness, this next section. Where Cuppa says, then goodbye, Carla. Where will you go? To a village, a town, a city, a capital? Carla says, once we had followers, we wandered from village to cities and capitals. We thought we were ascetics, but we weren't. But now, by the Naranjara River, the Buddha teaches Dharma to the living. I'll go to him. He'll be my teacher. Cuppa says, then give him my greetings, the guide of the world, and make an offering for me. Carla says, it's right what you say, Cuppa. I'll give him your greeting, the guide of the world, and make an offering for you. So, I'll read the last verse, because the last verse is the punchline, right? Then Carla went to the Naranjara River and saw the enlightened one teaching no death, pain, the cause of pain, the end of pain, and the great eightfold way that stills all pain. Carla bowed to his feet, walked past him on the right, made the offering for Cuppa, then set out into homelessness. The three knowledges have been realized, the Buddha's teaching has been done. So these are the situation of women in this time was they became wives. And it was they were kind of trapped. And some of them were lucky in that they were able to practice at home. And we're thinking of it from this standpoint about this in the Buddhist path, and it's equally true. Other paths and other ways to find happiness. Some of them were lucky and that they were able to find ways to practice, ways to find true happiness in what was generally a fairly hostile environment of marriage. Some of them were able to obtain permission and leave and go find community in convents, or even become a mendicant, which was a very dangerous thing for a woman to do at that time. So I find these stories very poignant. Obviously, terribly sad and heartbreaking, but poignant in the little moments of beauty that are inside. At least some of these stories. And important to reflect on, because as we routinely note when we talk about these women's poems and women's stories, a lot of this comes down to us today. I mean, in India today, it's certainly very much this way. And we're a long way from perfect in this country too. So those are my comments and thoughts and some poems. And with that, I'll stop talking and see what that brings up for folks. If you'd like me to reread any of the poems, just ask me and I will. Anything. So what comes up, people? Play.
Has anybody else heard of Mirabai?
I'm sorry?
Has anybody else heard of Mirabai?
Mirabai Star? Oh, Mirabai, yes, I have, but
Yeah.
not well.
So that made me think of her a lot. Because, when she was a little girl, she got a statue from a wandering ascetic outside of her palace. And there was a little statue of Krishna. And from that day forth, she considered herself married to Krishna. But of course, when she grew up, she got married off, because they were, she was a woman. She was a political bargaining chip.
Right.
And then she had the great fortune of her husband. Well, I don't want to say it like that, but her husband died. And so she was able to say, okay, well, I did what you asked. but now I'm going to be married to Krishna. And even then, members of her family tried to kill her because she was openly embracing untouchables in public temples. And she's to this day, a lot of her poems are still sung by Hindus and Muslims, and a lot of them have to do with the fact that she had to struggle against this fact of being a woman renouncing. And a lot of it's humorous, but a lot of it is also coded in deep tragedy. And just the friction that comes with a woman having her own spiritual goals. And it's just senseless, because there's an opportunity cost that is wasted for not giving people a voice, and it's not just in this case. I mean, how many great minds have we been denied by not properly educating women over time? And it's the same thing in this spiritual faculty.
And when we find the poems, the stories of women, the energy of a lot of these poems and stories is different. It's not the strong warrior masculine energy. So there's a different energy in it. So it's not just we're denied that, we're denied a whole avenue of stories and of approach. There's a flavor here that we deny ourselves, apart from basic humanity. Whitney.
I agree there's a different energy and there's a perseverance in all of the poems. And I think that's the poignant part. The part I react most strongly to is the Buddha one, the one where the Buddha's just praising this guy for ignoring the entreaties of a person who was fully dependent upon him, on not on the Buddha, but on this other guy for her life and her livelihood. And I cannot square that with enlightenment.
I know.
At all. I just don't, that's where it goes off the rails for me. And I just get angry.
Yeah. And I can rationalize it as follows, because I can't reconcile it either. I don't think it is capable of being reconciled with me. I mean, there's a point that we're trying to make, and the point is of the absolute commitment to the practice at the expense of all else, the commitment to the practice. Right? So there's a point that's trying to be made, but is made in such a profoundly uncompassionate way. And the truly awakened, there are no enlightened beings, there's only enlightened activity, Shunryu Suzuki. But that's just paraphrasing the truth. And enlightened activity is like the left hand, right hand. You've heard this one before, right? Somebody hurts my left hand, my right hand just comes and helps it. There's no question. It's not, what have you done for me lately? It just comes and helps. And to not have that for every living being is a horrible gap. Horrible, and it doesn't compute. So the rationalization is that these were not written down for at least 500 years after the Buddha was actually around. So we don't know what he actually said. All we know is what some people like to think he said, what they remember him saying. So I can rationalize it out as being not actually what the Buddha said, although I don't know. I just don't know. It's a deeply troublesome story. Deeply troublesome. David.
Thank you, Gareth. I agree. These are, that's one you asked what comes up, and for the most part, what comes up is distress at the situations. But as you work through it, it's to me it's remarkable. These are so old, and these things, yet we recognize them clearly today. And in many cases, these women, it comes out as a very strong example of suffering, and that the practice led them out of suffering. But it also, I think, at a higher level, just illustrates the human condition. And so I do feel, I'm coming at it from obviously from a male perspective, but it's still, like you said, the energy, just that sadness, I think we can all kind of touch into or be with. We can't correct these injustices, so it's almost like a koan at this point. It's just sad, wrong, but we can't. There's nothing we can do about it other than be with it. And so, in that terms, it's it's almost like a practice in suffering and compassion at the end of the day, because we can't do anything. So what do we do when we can't do anything?
Yeah.
I'm kind of confused because these are supposed to be a collection of poems of awakening, and the ones that I remember, each of the women do go into their, not all of them, but most of them, their background and their circumstances. But there's stanzas specifically about their personal awakening experience, and it was recorded partly as a teaching for others and encouragement.
Yeah.
I mean, these are all very sad stories, and but did you read the full poems?
I read the full poems as she presented them.
Yeah. Because I was, as I was listening to them, for each one, I was waiting for that, those words of wisdom that were meant to give, all the different paths.
Yeah.
That one takes to the final liberation, and the free, free, free. I always interpret it as, a personal liberation, not from, the bondage of marriage or the circumstances.
Yeah, and those two, I think it is very clearly, that's what it is.
Yeah, but I'm used to them saying something, like there's one about, she went to, who's the famous female teacher, Padakara, she said she walked and walked and couldn't still her mind, and she went to Padakara, who gave her advice, and she took it, and and lo and behold, and so I was just kind of waiting for these,
So there are about 50% of them gave that in this chapter, and 50% didn't. And I think that is part of the I think this is a wonderful book, and she's done a really lovely job pulling the stories together and creating coherence around what is otherwise just a rather abstract set of poems. And she's done so by going back into Buddha-Ghosha's commentaries and probably other commentaries from the time, which are dense and impenetrable and very esoteric. So she's done a really good job of passing it all out and making it accessible. And she's restructured it all so that there's coherent flow. And I think what she's doing, this is the chapter about being a wife, and it's a pretty miserable place to be.
Absolutely,
it's just a miserable place to be. And so I think that I don't think all the poems have a happy ending, and we've just got disproportionately more of them. But I have got one with a happy ending. So I think it's important because your point is right, and what it kind of builds on what you were saying, the the persistence and the resilience that comes through in the language. There's what's the word? Persistence and resilience, and there's a resistance in there, and that resistance can be very strong, gentle but strong, gentle but not forceful, and it just wears on it and wears through it. And so here's another uttara. I asked Patakara, what is the path? Patakara said, just see all thoughts, words, and actions arising all by themselves, not from some imaginary point within. I only partly understood, but I took a seat. As the sun was setting, I saw the endless line of one thing leading to another that had brought me to the Christian that night. As the moon was coming up, I saw the arising and passing away of all things in every direction. As dawn was breaking, wisdom rose in the east and set fire to the long, dark night. But don't take my word for it. Set fire to the darkness within. I promise it's like nothing you've ever seen. So these are, as I said, they're not translations, they're kind of rewordings, but some of these are very beautifully done. And that is the valence that's in most of these poems. But what I think she's trying to do in this chapter is bring out that it's not all, doesn't all come up smelling of roses. There's some tough stuff in there, big at that time. Does that?
Yes, thank you.
And to Kevin, you said there's nothing we can do but sit with it. So there's two things I want to say to that. One, sitting with it is really, 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 really important. Bernie Glassman, the Zen peacemakers, he's made a tradition out of, they go to Auschwitz, they were going to Montgomery, to the EJI memorial. They just go and they sit. Bearing witness. Bearing witness is what it's called. So just sitting is really important, not to be underestimated. And deeply, sincerely sitting, not just allowing it, but deeply, sincerely bringing it all in and sitting and holding it in there, creating space. That can be really, really powerful for you and for the world. The second thing is there actually is something we can do, and something it's really important for us to do, because and deeply sitting with it can help open the door for that. By really embodying this, by really recognizing this, by really letting this soak in, we can become much more in tune with injustice. And Buddha, it didn't go around advocating for equality and justice. He went around advocating for the end of suffering. And equality and justice cause suffering. So we can become much more in tune with how this kind of behavior, as it shows up today, gives rise to suffering in the world. And we can move into that suffering, and we can do things. We can see what was unskillful and figure out how to make sure things are more skillful now and going forward. If we're not willing, I think this was Churchill, if we're not willing to learn from our past, we're doomed to repeat it. Did you have something else? I think I saw your hands couple of you.
Yeah, I was Whitney brought up a point that I was mulling over, which is and you brought up a good point, but I'm getting ahead of myself. How could this wonderful any enlightened being not see the lack of compassion in his answer to the woman who has a starving child and no options, you know? How how could, you know, hundreds and hundreds of years of these, you know, Zen Buddhist abbots who are, you know, refuse to, you know, admit women, and as the justification that they were, you know, vile and unclean and incapable of awakening, and they would have to die and come back as men. You know, it's like, you know, trying to, that's a hard one.
Very hard. And as I say, I mean, it's not really a satisfactory answer, but the best answer I can come up with is that all these stories of the Buddha that come down to us in the canon are the recollections of people who are kind of retelling the story that they think is the right story. And so it's a corrupted story.
Yeah.
It is very troublesome. And you've got Buddha's own story where he left his wife and child behind. So the story is a difficult one, but the I won't read it again. But that part, right? That one I just read. This stuff works. But
I can't help but point out that there's a certain level of poetic justice, literally, in that the only thing that we know about one of these horrible husbands is that he has a tiny parasol.
Yes.
And that's his legacy after 2,500 years. And there's a certain level of humor that I can't get past, that, you know, that's, you know, what we got from her was a declaration of liberation.
And the drudgery of opening the
Yes.
parasol.
And it is horrible that she had to go through that, but I think there's a certain modicum of justice in that is what has been immortalized. You know, that's what's echoed down.
and that's one for what it's worth. Free, I am free, free from a pestilence, etc., etc. The umbrella piece, and R says to herself, our happiness, and meditates with happiness. So it's very gentle, very low key, but that's the punchline that you're looking for.
Mirabai has a very similar poem where she's like, I haven't been with a man for 2 years. And then she says, she talks to the moon about it, and the moon's like, I haven't been with a man ever. And Mirabai's like, okay, well, I think I can go a lot longer then. I guess I'm not missing anything. It's really funny.
Devin.
And so this does bring up, something came up then with Clay's discussion. I think it started with one of the poems about the whole concept of marriage and relationships. We even now culturally put a whole lot of stake in those. I'm not necessarily looking for an answer, but it is something that, how we work within them, how we work our practice in these marriages and relationships we have, given the light that, the other person in them may, have a completely different point of view. It's just now, I guess I've come across it a little bit in practice, but tonight really kind of brings it home. It's just, okay, how do we then, what might we do in our relationships to, given this, we only have half of the information.
Yeah, I mean, most of the world, the practice of Buddhism for most people is congregational. So it's very much like going to synagogue or church. You go on a Friday evening or a Sunday morning, and that's it. Just take the family, and then you'll have the fellowship dinner, and it's like community stuff. And then you support by joining the mission, the various mission groups, making sandwiches or feeding the food insecure and so forth. But we don't do that here. It's very strange because we have a much more immersive practice. There is one of the reasons Buddhism took off over here is because we get to practice, we get to sit, and it's how do you integrate that? How do you match that with a family that isn't interested in spending all day Saturday and Sunday sitting in a room silently? It's a good question, isn't it? There's a Cohen, my friend.
There's several tonight.
Yeah.
You gave me some ideas.
Anybody else got anything before we wrap up? Whitney.
I'll just add that the stories, both from the female perspective and then that one that bothers me so much from the Buddhist perspective, more or less suggest the relationships are unimportant. The only thing that's important is the sitting.
Yeah. And that's why we're troubled by them, right?
Yeah.
Because what use is your practice if it doesn't show up as compassion in the world? And the Buddha clearly was profoundly compassionate. I mean, you read most of the stories, and he's clearly profoundly compassionate. So it just doesn't fit. And yet, it's there. Yes.
Well, when we were talking about this, I brought up the koan from I forgot what collection it's in, but Whitney, you might remember it. I believe it's in Hidden Lamp. It's the old Japanese woman who had been, she had a hut that a hermit, monk lived in, and she was supporting him. And this had been going on for years, and she decided to test him. So she sent her niece over with the instructions, try your best to just seduce him and see what happens. And, the monk was, abrupt and cold and, told her to get going, that he was a monk and he didn't do that kind of nonsense. So the niece went back and told her aunt, who was furious, and said, that shyster, that poser, and chased them out and burned down the hut. It being that his reaction should have been one for compassion, what's going on? I'm a monk. You've come here. Is something troubling you, young lady? Instead of being mean.
There's another story which is Hakuin. I'm sure you've all heard this one. Hakuin was I think he was an 18th century Japanese Zen dude. He was a Rinzai reformer. Story goes, a girl in the village had a
Mm.
It had an illegitimate child. And the villagers are all really angry. Who's the father? Who's the father? Monk up on the hill. So they went up and, you're the father, you're the father. She says, you're the father. He said, is that so? If you're the father, you need to look after the child. That's the child then, raises the child. Several years later, she fesses up because she's still in love with the young man. And she says, he's really the father. He says, yes, I am. So they got them out in all the villages in a storm and they say, she says, he's the father. He says, is that so? So the child should go with him. Is that so? There's total non-resistance and complete compassion and love. And my own experience, not in any particularly profound way, but my own experience with the years of my practice is that is the direction the practice takes us in. It opens us up, makes us more sensitive, more compassionate, more loving to everybody and everything. So that's the level at which the story really doesn't compute, because it just completely conflicts with experience. And that, with the koan you just described, that is experience. If somebody comes and says, "Man, I'm missing something here. Sit down, have a cup of tea. What's going on? Tell me, what's up?" Please.
I have a question about that story.
Mhm.
Um, in the stories, they don't necessarily explain everyone's feelings.
Right.
They're explaining actions.
Yep.
So you're talking about a monk who is acting compassionate, but it doesn't explain his internal experience, which probably is more complicated because he's a human being. I don't know. I don't have a fully formed question, but I'm just wondering about. It just seems like it would require a lot of managing one's own feelings to not show whatever the feelings are in receiving this information. Like, I mean, I would imagine, I don't know how the monk may have felt in the first moment, like, oh, it's your responsibility to care for this child. I don't know what the feelings would be, but definitely, I imagine by the time the child's a little older, the monk will have been attached. And so he probably would feel some sadness at receiving information that he must release the child or whatever, So I don't know what my question is, but I'm just wondering about, like, maybe the question is, like, what are the wise actions in that? Obviously, the wise action is to allow the child to go, but then what's the wise action for oneself? Yeah.
So I'll give you two thoughts on that. So this opening of the heart to compassion that happens with practice includes the self. It's important that we bring compassion to bear here as well as there. So your point is absolutely right, and that compassion becomes this broad thing that includes the self as well. The second thing is, and this is just something you've got to try and find it for yourself, what actually happens if you spend a long time meditating, is you get much less caught up in your own stories. So self-centered feelings start to fade away. There's less ego. The monk, somebody who's been sitting in a hermitage for a couple of decades, if he's done it right, there's not a lot of ego left. And the resistance to looking after the child, he's got a child who's suffering, he's not got a home, what you do is obvious, just logically, it's obvious. And beyond that, there's not a lot of emotion shown. Because you can't really be there for yourself or for other people if all these stories, these self-defensive mechanisms that give rise to all our emotions, what's shown up. So the practice is, those wear away with the practice. And there's much more open And it's not to indicate, it's not to suggest that there's a coldness, quite the opposite. Quite the opposite. It's just a beautiful warmth, but there's no center in it. Does that make any kind of sense?
I think I understand conceptually, but I
Yeah.
still have the question about the attachment feeling, like, yeah, especially to a child.
Well, but to be attached is to be attached for yourself,
Mhm.
by definition. To be attached to the child is entirely about you. It's not about the child, it's about you. So somebody who truly loves that child, loves that child for itself and wants what's best for that child. Now, it is quite possible, maybe quite likely, that part of the answer is, well, yeah, go away. But we've spent a lot of time together. There's a very close bond here. It would be very foolish not to let the child come up and spend a lot of time with you. But that's for the child and not for me. To really care for the child is precisely to get myself out of it. The attachment, I mean, our practice is very much about letting go of all those self-centered attachments. And it just happens over time, slowly and incrementally. Because they're all based on stories we tell ourselves about who we think we are. Getting closer?
That makes sense, yeah.
We're a few minutes over, so we ought to let everybody go. Whitney, Kevin, great to see you both. See you soon.
I